before.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy lives to join us for the YIC Webinar 20. All right, let me get my screen share going for us. Oh, and then everything moves, which is always so much fun. All right. Let's see. Heidi, are you seeing my PowerPoint, the full screen? Awesome. All right. Okay, so I do have 9 a.m., but let me hit dismiss on these few reminders so we don't have funny noises in the background. There we go. All right, so today's agenda, I finally get to introduce and send out the support documents I've been working on since pretty much fall of 2020. So that'll be fun to give you a quick snapshot here in just a moment. And then I'm going to introduce Liz Rivera, who will do a presentation for us on brain science. And then Liz is going to wrap up for us just a few minutes early so that I can introduce my new supervisor, the new coordinator of youth in custody at the Board of Ed, Benjamin Carrier. And then, of course, share that post-trading survey link with everybody. All right. So to introduce the documents, it's always such a trick when you're online, but I did go ahead and pull up the PDF versions of them because I feel like that's just the easiest way to give everybody a sneak peek before I send them out on email. So I've created 4 documents. The first one is a key points document, and basically this is just a summary of the Check and Connect Implementing with Fidelity Guide. And this would help program administrators, first of all, decide to implement Check and Connect, and then secondly, help them evaluate their program for fidelity. The other documents I've created is a Utah Mentor Quick Start, which is a snapshot, just a real quick, brief introduction of where mentors should start. And then a practice profile form, which is a self-evaluation tool that our mentors can use. And it covers, of course, the ABCs, which are our academic, behavior, and connection, as well as some items on protective factors. The last of the documents is the biggest, and it is the best practices, which includes the mentor practice profile and the quick start. Here is the table of contents, just to give you, like I said, a sneak peek before I send these out to all of the teams by email tomorrow. And these are just meant to be support documents to help everybody. I had a fabulous team to work with. It was the locally certified trainers, as well as our former supervisor, Natay Dearden at the State Board of Ed. So it's been a long time coming, but I am so excited to share these out with everybody. All right, let's get back to the PowerPoint and introduce Liz. Oop, I thought I hid that. Anyway, all right. Liz is the Director of Education for Utah Foster Care. She is privileged to educate potential and current foster and adoptive parents about the needs of children and youth in care. Her career began in child welfare over 28 years ago in direct service with youth at Salt Lake County Youth Services. She has worked with foster and adoptive families at Utah Foster Care for 22 years, first as an SLB regional trainer, and now as the Director of Education. She has a master's degree in communication from the University of Utah and is a registered Circle of Security parenting facilitator, as well as a TBRI practitioner. One of Liz's favorite quotes is from Sufi wisdom: "Thirst is proof of water," which reminds us that our deepest hopes are actually evidence of the existence of what we all hope for. All right, so now I will stop sharing and turn the screen privileges over to Miss Liz to have her present.
Get myself off mute and grab this. Okay,
Right.
So Amanda and I were talking before we started, and I prefer a conversation as much as possible, which of course is more difficult in this medium than others. But you do have the chat function, and Amanda's going to be monitoring that. So as I am talking, if there's questions, something you want me to clarify, go back over. If you have a great example of something, anything, a question about how this applies in the work you're doing, please feel free to put that in chat, and I will try to answer as much as I can in the stream of our conversation. And one reason I like to do that is because, well, a couple things. One, we're talking about the brain tonight or today, and I'm going to talk about a man named Stephen Porges, and he is the theorist behind the polyvagal theory, which some of you may be familiar with. And the polyvagal theory is really about what's called what he calls neuroception, which is a sense of safety. And what's interesting is that lecture is identified by our brain as an unsafe situation, whereas relational engagement or conversation is considered a safe engagement. And so even though it seems a little weird that me just talking for almost 2 hours isn't going to feel safe, we know that when the social engagement is activated, that people do feel more safe. And so that's one of the reasons I prefer this. And then also this way I can tailor our conversation to what you're doing. I normally train foster and adoptive parents. I have trained in education settings before, in school settings, but my stock and trade is parents. And so you'll hear me sometimes reverting to that language, but really I'm talking about caregivers in general. I believe all of us who work with children have that caregiving role. And so just kind of, maybe if I use the word parent, just kind of substitute that. Or if you want to really talk about how this may apply more specifically to what you're doing, then please throw that in chat and get me on track. Okay, and then I know that, I'm not sure, Amanda, if this presentation has been shared with them, the document. If you want to, you certainly are welcome to. I have no sense of proprietary, ownership of this. I just feel like it's okay to be out there in the world. And if any of you do get the document, if you print it in the notes way, you get the PowerPoint on the top and you get the notes section. And there's a lot of additional information in those notes. And so when I used to train this in person, which I've done for a while, and I'd hand this out, I always felt like that note section was really important because it helps to clarify and contextualize some of these things we're talking about.
So I want to share that out, just so you know, Liz. I can do that as part of the follow-up.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Okay, and this is, some of you may be familiar with a lot of this information, but if it's really new to you, it's nice to be able to have a chance to review it as well as get a little bit of extra information. And then I have like reading suggestions and stuff like that on there too. So the first thing I just want to talk about is just the beginning of brain development, which really happens in utero. And this is, it's amazing actually how vulnerable we are in utero from the very beginning, and that there's so many things, and we'll talk a little more about these in a few minutes, that we can be exposed to in utero that can affect how our brains develop in utero, but also kind of sets a trajectory for how we develop ongoing. Although, and I'll stress this quite a bit too, our brains remain incredibly plastic throughout our lives, and that's because as human beings, we have such a varied way of living. We live all over the world in all kinds of climates and all kinds of cultures and all kinds of situations. And our brains are designed by evolution to allow us to survive in those environments. And if our brain were so static that we couldn't continue to evolve brain-wise in our life, we would have less opportunity for survival. And so there is, even though early insults and utero insults and early life insults can have lifelong effects, and some more than others. I also want to stress that the brain itself remains fairly plastic, and there's still opportunity to change. We'll talk a little about what that change looks like. And it's not always just a change in the sense that we are changing what already was laid down, but we are creating alternative pathways for folks. And sometimes that's what change looks like. And we'll talk a little about that too. So if there is any kind of insult during brain development in utero, what part of the brain is affected is when that insult occurs. And I'm going to talk a little about alcohol in a few minutes. And alcohol is what's called a teratogen, and it means something that is introduced into the womb that can affect the baby. And that might be brain development, it might be physical development, but it's usually some kind of toxic environmental substance. And alcohol is probably the most common of those. as well as probably the most damaging of those. But what's difficult about alcohol is being able to pin down how much was used at what point in that gestation period. So if it's really early on, it will affect certain parts of the brain more than it will if the drinking occurs later on. We do know that the earlier the mother is drinking, the more that foundational piece gets damaged. And what's particularly difficult about that is that many women maybe not know they're pregnant for many weeks into the pregnancy, and they may continue to be drinking and drinking heavily. And maybe they stop as soon as they find out they're pregnant, which if they do, hallelujah. But the reality is that there already may be some damage to those early stages of development, which then may affect later stages of development. Whereas drinking that might come the last trimester may be less damaging to that early foundation, although it will still have some effects. So and this is where things do get difficult, because trying to figure out when something, a development also may have occurred in utero is difficult. Now I want to talk on the next slide. This is the prenatal risk. Now, one I didn't put on here, and I was going through this last night, and after I did, I thought, oh my gosh, I should have updated. This is a slide I need to update, because one of the things I actually want to update on here is really important. Actually, there's well, I have one on here, but the other one is pollution. And if any of you have been following some of the I'm not sure what they call them, but the scientists who study how air pollution affects human beings, there are some who focus on prenatal exposure to pollution. And it turns out that it can have a significant effect. So on a day like today, when we look out our windows, and maybe you're normally able to see the mountains and the foothills, and today you cannot even see them, that is actually a risk. And so it's something to be very aware of, and if it's something you're concerned about, you know, I hope I'm not going to offend anybody here, but people, when they were really upset about having children wear masks in schools, and people were saying they can't breathe, and I think, well, what about air pollution? They can't breathe very well with that either. So, you know, when we're concerned about our children, we need to be concerned about our children fully, and that includes in utero, and pollution turns out to be a very concerning effect for them. Now, I talked briefly about alcohol. Alcohol is probably the most, I already said this, most damaging and common toxin that gets introduced. Now, drugs, there's not as much research on the long-term implications of drugs. We're starting to see quite a bit come in on methamphetamine, because you think about when that was the early 2000s, we really saw that heavy usage of that. So some of that research is coming out now. We have some on marijuana, we have some on cocaine. I haven't seen a lot on heroin long-term, but what the research indicates is that if the child is born exposed or even addicted, the worst effects are early on, with actually the withdrawal from that drug, and then the potential for setting them up for easy addiction later on in life. And so that can persist. But what the research indicates is that while there may be some minor effects around impulsivity, aggression, oppositional behaviors, it isn't statistically significant from a control group of kids who were not exposed to drugs. So I'm not saying then it's fine if, you know, a mother uses illicit drugs while she's pregnant, but what we do know is that right now it looks like that harm isn't significant long-term. Now that's overall, because to any individual that may be different. Whenever we look at statistics, we have to remember they're looking at a large group, and we're not necessarily looking at an individual. And so at an individual level, you may see more harm than maybe what you see in a large group. And once again, you know, trying to control for how much was used, when it was used, what else was being used. Because what we do know is that if women are using these kind of substances while they're pregnant, they're usually using any kind of substance they can get a hold of. So it's very rare you're going to have a mother who only has used one thing. If they're using one thing, they're usually using anything. And so to try to figure out, what those differences are between those multiple usages is very, very difficult, if not impossible. But we do know with alcohol that the effects can be severe and that they are long-term. So, and I think this is something that's really important when I talk with parents who may be parenting either in foster care or potentially adopting a child who's been exposed to alcohol, is to think about them as if they're born with something like Down syndrome or autism. It's something they have, and it's not going to go away. And now we just need to figure out how to mitigate and navigate and help that child do that with that brain damage that has occurred. And I think people want to really fight against it, that understanding, because we know that if the mother hadn't drank during pregnancy, then there wouldn't be these effects, but she did. And the reality is that that's now the reality, and we need to deal with what is instead of always wishing what wasn't, what was that isn't. Another thing about alcohol, which is the research is interesting, is there are some researchers who theorize that part of the harm that's being done by a mother who's using alcohol during pregnancy is malnutrition. So it's not just the alcohol that's damaging the brain, which it is, but it's also the fact that if she's using alcohol, especially heavily, she's probably not taking care of herself in other ways, including eating regularly and eating a healthful diet. And so there's actually some research that shows that infants born exposed to alcohol, are prenatally exposed to alcohol, actually are malnourished, and they have some very specific, and I'm trying now to pull it out of my head and I can't, but there's a very specific mineral that they consistently are low on, and that the research shows that if that baby and very young child can be supplemented with that nutrient, and I think it starts with a C, but I'm just not being able to pull it out of my head, that the effects may be reduced. And so that's really good news. The bad news, though, is that if the child, and I think it's up to age 5, so if we, after the child comes into care, maybe at 6 or 7, and maybe they've been diagnosed with fetal alcohol, which is actually incredibly difficult to get them diagnosed with that. But if they have been diagnosed with an FASD, that at that point it's probably too late to supplement with that nutrient. So it's good, like everything else in life, the earlier the intervention, the better. And that's certainly true in this case. And there's actually some researchers, which I think is fascinating research, that they will recruit women who are pregnant, who are drinking. So that's a pretty high ask, that they're asking women to acknowledge the fact that they're drinking. And these researchers actually do not ask the women to stop drinking. They simply supplement that mother's diet, and then they see the extent of the damage, if it's any different when that child is born, which I still wonder what IRB approved that training, because seeing someone do something that is harming a child is interesting, but the fact that they are doing this with other interventions, because I think their idea is, especially if the mother is an alcoholic, the likelihood of her not drinking is very low. And so then they want to find something to mitigate it. And that's maybe why that research was approved. Mercury, certainly one we've talked about. One I don't have up here that I also have up here is lead. So exposure to lead, which is very common in older homes with lead-based paint, and homes in which that hasn't been mitigated in. And then we talked about malnutrition. So the folic acid, or the iron deficiency is the most common nutritional deficiency in the United States. And it can lead to significant brain dysfunction. So when we're born, this lower part of our brain closes, but without the folic acid, that may not happen. So years ago in Utah, we had someone come and present about this. They were seeing, and once again, I guess I'm not a morning person. If this was 9 o'clock at night, I'd be pulling this stuff out like no problem. 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm not quite as good at pulling it out. And if any of you know, and I'm sure some of you do, what the name of that condition is when it doesn't close. But they were seeing a rash of this in Utah, and particularly among immigrant communities who were from Central and South America. And then what they realized is they were using a kind of flour for like their tortillas and other baked goods that was traditional to those areas of the world. And that flour was not supplemented with folic acid like most of ours in the United States is. And so just and I still remember seeing this even just a few years ago, that they did a big public campaign to these communities to get them to start using enriched flour, so that and they saw these cases drop. So just something as simple as making sure the mother is eating enriched flour while she's pregnant can have a significant difference. And then the maternal stress. Now I have that word high, really highlighted, because stress is a part of all of our lives, especially now. And sometimes I wonder why we've designed such stressful lives. So I was on Instagram the other day, and someone was putting this cute little meme of their dog, like acting like it was upset because tomorrow was Monday. And I'm thinking the only reason we're upset because tomorrow is Monday is because we've created this for ourselves. This is the world we've created, and then we all stress to live in this world. And sometimes I wonder why we've done that and why we can't change it. So stress is just a normal part of life, and certainly for a mother who's expecting, there's a lot of things, that additional stressors that she may face that are just normal parts of life and becoming a parent. But what we're talking about here is we're talking about alcohol and drug use, and the kind of life that often leads folks to alcohol and drug use, domestic violence, homelessness, severe financial distress, that kind of stress. A mother with mental health issues, significant mental health issues that aren't being treated, that the stress hormones that our bodies release naturally in response to stress, and significant stress, that those can pass through to the infant. And so the theory then is that, first of all, that those stress hormones themselves are actually causing physical differences in the brain. But the theory about why that is, and this I think makes perfect sense, once again going back to the idea of plasticity and survival and evolution, is that if the baby in utero is getting all of these stress hormones from the mother, the idea is that, oh my goodness, that world out there is a really frightening, scary, dangerous world. And so I better prepare my brain to live in that kind of world. And so these infants are often born with much higher stress response. So going back to the polyvagal theory and vagal tone, one of the things babies are tested is their vagal tone when they're born. And these children often have very low vagal tone, and so which can affect their ability to respond to stress. And so we see these babies as often hypersensitive to environmental input, so sound and light. They may respond much more anxiously. They're harder to soothe. And then as they develop and grow, it's not uncommon to see anxiety disorders with these kids. And all of this makes perfect sense. The brain is doing exactly what it's designed to do, which is change in response to the environment in order to promote survival. And so if my mother's body has been telling me as an infant in utero, this is a dangerous world, I'm going to develop in such a way to survive in that world. And so my brain will be primed to be anxious and worried and hypervigilant all of the time, which then gets diagnosed often as anxiety. And then maternal illness. I don't think we know anything about COVID yet, about if there's any long-term effects of that, but we do know about the flu, that mothers who get the flu while pregnant, that can be very dangerous for the infant. In fact, there's research linking schizophrenia. Now, there usually is some kind of also family genetic history on schizophrenia, but it's more likely in children whose mothers also had the flu while they were pregnant. And so the effects of whether it's the antibodies or the stress or, whatever it is. And I've read a couple of studies on this, and they're not 100% showing the mechanisms, but there is a real concern. So one reason that pregnant women who during flu season are really advised to get the flu shot is because of the danger to the infant in utero. And so very important for the flu vaccine. And then of course radiation, which is why, if you go to the dentist or, anything like that, they always put those big heavy tapes on you. And which I was talking to my dentist the other day, and I have a friend of mine that just had thyroid cancer, and she was reading something about one of the potential exposures being going to the dentist. And I was asking my dentist about, why don't we cover our necks? And we had this whole conversation about exposure to radiation and thyroid cancer, but certainly if an infant is exposed, that's concerning. Now, we talked about prenatal risks, and for a lot of the kids that you guys are working with, these are kids who've been exposed to risks prenatally, and certainly we can have kids who are exposed to multiple ones of these. So once again, we talked about alcohol, we talked about malnutrition, we talked about stress, maternal illness. You can have an infant who's exposed to all of these. So already they're born with some compromised brain development from the beginning. And I know years ago, so I've been working, in the child welfare world for almost 30 years, and for a long time, I think it's starting to dissipate, but for a long time, we had families who always wanted to adopt. They wanted to adopt newborns, and sometimes it was because maybe they were infertile and they were hoping to be able to experience more of a typical way of a family starting with a newborn. But then there were also people who just felt like, if I can get them when they're a newborn, then we won't have any problems with them because they won't have been exposed to any kind of trauma. And what we know now is, of course, that's absolutely not true. And I actually did a similar presentation to this, a little bit different, but a similar one at the Utah Council for Adoption a few years ago when we were still in person. And many of them had adopted infants, newborn infants, private adoption. And these kids are now, mid-school age, adolescents, maybe sometimes even early adulthood. And some of these things, some of the issues are showing up. And many of them would say something like, I'm so surprised because we've had them since they were day one and they've lived in a safe, stable environment. And yet they're still manifesting some of the same kind of issues that we may see in a child who's come out of a more traumatic environment. And so we know that early, and then plus there's the loss of that family of origin, and that can create issues as well. But that prenatal exposure to some of these developmental insults can have long-lasting effects, even when the child is not exposed to other trauma. And also, I'm trying to, I hope that doesn't sound hopeless, because it isn't, because kids can be struggling and functioning okay at the same time. And I think that's true for a lot of us today, is there's areas of our lives we struggle in, and there's areas of our lives we do just fine in. And so our lives are combinations of strength and struggle. And just because a child has some of these early developmental insults that may have caused long-term effects, that doesn't mean there's not areas of strength. And so what we then really focus on is how, just like all of us here today have done in our lives, is how do I use my areas of strength to mitigate my areas of struggle. And just a real quick example of this, just developmentally, whatever there is in my brain, I have very, very poor spatial relations. I mix things up. I mix left and right up all the time. I mix, I can't visualize space. When someone talks to me about something physical and, just talks to me, I cannot visualize it. And I've always been like that. And everybody else in my family is not like that. And so I'm surrounded by people who are really good at spatial relations, and I have no ability to do that. So what I've done in my life then is instead of becoming an architect, which I probably couldn't do, I have focused more on, I'm a good reader. So I've focused on things like around reading and gardening and, this kind of work with child welfare and social work. So, and strengthening my ability in those areas hasn't gotten rid of this other struggle. I still struggle every day with this other thing. but it allows me to feel successful in my life and to have some ability to do well in my life. And the same thing with our kids is that when we see where they struggle, we kind of build supports and scaffolding around those struggles and then really focus on those strengths and recognizing that that's true for every single one of us as well as our kids. Sometimes it just may be more pronounced with our kids. So those postnatal risks, and I think this is a lot of times what we think about when we think about trauma and brain development, and it certainly does affect it because now, once again, the brain is all about survival. And so if whatever message I get in utero, and then what happens when I'm born into this environment, what happens after I'm born is still going to have significant effects, especially in that first 3 to 5 years when the brain is now developing rapidly outside of the womb. So any abuse that's occurring, particularly abuse by caregivers, because your caregiver is supposed to be the one who keeps you safe. But if they're the one that's hurting you, who do you go to? And this is an attachment issue as well, because if my attachment figure, who is the person that I turn to in times of stress, is the source of the stress, that prevents an unsolvable dilemma for the child. And then neglect is the most common reason that children come into foster care. And most of the neglect cases are driven by drug and alcohol dependency. And if the parent weren't using, they may not be neglectful. And so when children come into care and there's a service plan for their parents, usually the first thing that the state goes after are those substance use disorders and helping the parent to be able to find recovery so that they can be an effective and safe parent. But there's other reasons for neglect as well besides drugs, but it is the number one reason that children come into care. And there's a lot of controversy about this in child welfare because neglect can also be associated with lack of financial resources. And so we want to always be careful we're not conflating neglectful parenting with poverty. And I don't know the experiment has been long enough, and there's a lot of reasons I wish they would extend the child tax credits. One of them is that a lot of researchers believe that if parents were able to continue to get that money on a monthly basis, that we would actually see rates of child maltreatment decrease. Abuse also, and okay, I'm kind of mixing things up over here. Neglect and poverty can be conflated, meaning that they look similar, but they're not the same things, but we think they are because they're so similar. Abuse and other forms of neglect do increase so real abuse and real neglect do increase with financial stress. So the more the more lack of financial resources a family has, we do see a increase of abuse and neglect as well. So a couple things. One is if families had more financial stability, there'd be less likely that we're conflating neglect with poverty because poverty would decrease and those families would have the resources they need and it wouldn't look like neglect anymore. But also we would see true neglect and true physical abuse decrease. And so if these child tax credits could continue for a few years, we actually may start to see a decrease in child maltreatment across our country. I don't think it's going to happen because I think if I remember right, they expired in January, and I think it's part of the bill that isn't going anywhere in the Senate. But so I don't think that's going to happen. We only have a year of data. That's not going to be enough. But there are a lot of people who work in researching child welfare who believe that that's one of the best interventions we can do is actually cash to the family to start to decrease maltreatment. Now, sexual abuse though is not associated with financial standing. So while physical abuse and neglect do have a correlation with the family's financial well-being, sexual abuse does not. So there's no correlation with socioeconomics and sexual abuse. So that's something that requires a different kind of intervention. And then I talked briefly about relational trauma. So if the attachment figure is the one who is hurting the child, or if the attachment figure is themselves traumatized, and this is very common we see with our population of children, that their parents also have been through a lot of trauma in their life, maybe currently being traumatized. Their ability to show up for their child as bigger, stronger, wiser, and kind is really limited. And so once again, the brain, the way our brains are designed to develop is, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on too, is in relationship. It's in safety and connection and attunement, and that just, our brains just thrive and they fire and they wire, and it's just the best thing in the world. But if I have a caregiver who maybe they're not neglectful, maybe they're not abusive, but they're not available emotionally, they dissociate maybe because of their own traumatic history, or they have been taught maybe at a family culture level, and maybe even at a greater level of culture, maybe that babies shouldn't control our lives by crying, and we shouldn't respond to them when they cry, and we should teach them to be self-sufficient, and all of that, all those messages are coming across, and so the parent isn't responsive, isn't warm, isn't engaging, because they think that they're raising a self-sufficient individual if they do that. Then that actually can be a form of relational trauma. Now, probably a small t trauma and not a big T trauma, but trauma nevertheless, and it will affect then how the brain develops and how that child is able to engage in particularly emotionally intimate relationships later on in their life. So it can have long-term effects. And then certainly physical injury. So I think the one we worry about the most with our kids is traumatic brain injury and concussion. So a lot of conversation in the last several years around football and soccer. And most of you who have kids this age, I'm sure you're really diligent about making sure they wear their bike helmet or their ski helmet, because we know that having that brain exposed to those traumatic physical shocks can be really damaging. Did someone have a question? It sounded like someone unmuted. Okay, all right. So this is just a quick infographic looking at the sources of toxic stress. So you're going to hear a lot of different phrases when you are reading this information. Toxic stress is a really common one. Trauma is a common one. Child maltreatment, and there's just a lot of terms that kind of get used interchangeably. So I find this really fascinating, because one thing I didn't talk about on this one is that what can lead to relational trauma is postpartum depression. And when we look at this quick infographic, we see that almost twice the rate of maltreatment. So we think about, so we have Prevent Child Abuse Utah, and they're all over the nation, and they're wonderful and important. They do amazing work. And yet the reality is that a mother who may be doing the very best she can, and everyone in her neighborhood thinks she's doing well, and even in her family thinks she's doing well, can really, really be struggling with postpartum depression and anxiety. And that itself can have long-term effects on the baby's brain. In fact, years ago, I remember reading a study that talked about that a baby whose mother is still experiencing postpartum, and I want to be really careful here. This is not blame the mother. I feel like I'm saying mother a lot. This is not blame the mother. I am a very strong believer in prevention, and I think that one of the areas in which we fail is we do not take good enough care of mothers in general, and certainly not vulnerable mothers. Mothers should never be left to do this on their own. We're not evolutionarily designed to. Culturally, that's what's happened, but it's not our ideal. And so if a mother is experiencing postpartum depression, it's not a failure on her part. It's a failure of the system that should be supporting mothers as they're having young children, which is incredibly stressful. So postpartum depression and anxiety, if that mother is experiencing that past 3 months, the baby's 3rd month, the long-term effects seem to be permanent. And what that can look like is, this is right brain to right brain. So when I'm holding my baby, my right brain, now I'm really careful here, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on too, that when we talk about right and left brain, that we talk about them sometimes as if they're completely separate, when in reality, they're very connected. So when someone says, oh, I'm really right brain, or I'm really left brain, that's never really accurate language, because right brain processes require left brain activation and vice versa. So it's a myth that, we're right brain or left brain. However, we do have hemispheric specialities, and that allows our brain to be that much more complicated and do that much more stuff. So our hemispheres do specialize, even though they also really rely upon each other. And there's, you guys know, the corpus callosum, which is the fibers that connect the two, and those are in healthy people. Those connections are very strong and very dense. So, but if a mother is really depressed, and particularly has very depressed affect, and those of us who may struggle with depression or have people in our lives who struggle with depression, you know what depressed affect is. It is that, kind of that low energy, not a lot of facial expression, maybe kind of flat. The voice is a little bit flat. And that mother engaging with her infant, and she's doing everything. She's feeding the baby, she's holding the baby, she's responding when they cry, and yet her affect remains really flat. That baby's right brain, if this goes on past the 3rd month, that baby's right brain begins to develop the same way her right brain is operating in that moment, in that time. And so these babies oftentimes develop symptoms that look a lot like depression as they get older. Also, interestingly, and this is what we would consider a secondary effect, traumatic effect, is if you have 2 6-month-old babies, one 6-month-old baby whose mother is not experiencing postpartum depression, or she was able to get treatment and support, and a baby whose mother is experiencing postpartum depression, and that's continued on past that 3rd month. These 2 babies, when they interact with strangers, strangers will interact with the baby of the non-depressed mother more quickly, with more joy and excitement and interaction and energy than they do with the baby of the depressed mother. And this makes sense, because that baby probably has somewhat of a flat affect too. And because we respond to affect, those strangers then interact with that baby less. There's less engagement, there's less energy, there's less joy. So then this baby from strangers is getting a similar reaction that she's been getting from her mother. And so it perpetuates these cycles. And that is, and this is true for a lot of issues that our kids face, is that when they interact with people outside of their parents, oftentimes those other people, teachers and neighbors and family members, react to how the baby is reacted to their environment, and thus perpetuating those brain connections, and is something I think we need to be aware of and conscious of. And this gets a little tricky, because when you're interacting with a baby, you don't necessarily ask the mother, I see your baby's a little bit flat affect. Are you experiencing postpartum depression? Maybe we should, I don't know. But it's something I think we do need to be very conscious of, that when we're interacting with children, that we're really paying attention. This is a big part of attunement. We're paying attention to what that child is eliciting in us. So are they eliciting our low energy in interaction? Are they eliciting joy from us? Are they eliciting annoyance, frustration, irritation, anger? And all of those things, they're clues to what's going on for the child. It's also clues for what's going on in us, and maybe our own history, and how our own history might be interacting with this child. And for us to be aware of that, so that we can then be aware, this child irritates me. And there's kids I've worked with in the past who I just am like, ugh, I just don't like them. And I have to be really conscious of that and overcome my own natural reaction to try to think about, what does this kid actually need from me, not what is my natural reaction to them. And that's a critical piece of attunement. Now, we'll talk a little bit about neurons. So neurons is really, our brains are made up of. So our brains are made up of 2 kinds of brain cells: the neuron, which is what we call the gray matter, and the glial cells, which are called the white matter. And we don't talk a lot about the glial cells. I remember hearing a neurologist one time talk about, we have neurologists, we don't have gliologists. And so a lot of people are familiar with neurons, but not as many people are familiar with the glial cells. And the glial cells are very important because they insulate, we'll talk about this in a second, but they insulate the connections between neurons, and which allows our brains to process information up to 1,000 times more quickly, and helps to make sure that we're not getting interference from other signals that are firing, and also helps you smooth out things like movement. So any of you who've ever known anyone with multiple sclerosis, it's an autoimmune disease, which means that the body's immune system is attacking itself, the body, and the part of the body is the glial cells that multiple sclerosis is affecting, the white matter. And that's why, and it depends on where it's happening, but if it's happening in the movement areas, it's why you see a lot of movement issues with multiple sclerosis, because it is breaking down the glial cells, which helps to create more of a smooth movement, because we're not getting the cross firing, and the firing is happening more quickly. So neurons, were born with millions of them, and they used to think we never got any new neurons after birth, but now we do know there's something called neurogenesis that continues to occur throughout our life, although at a much smaller scale than it does after birth. And there's some research that shows that very vigorous exercise actually leads to greater neurogenesis, but it's a very vigorous exercise. It's like running at I don't know. I don't even know what fast running is. I'm not a big runner, so I don't really know, but maybe it's 7 miles an hour. I don't know what it is, but it's like you're running really fast, and for an extended period of time, that's actually what it requires to speed up neurogenesis. But we also just have kind of natural neurogenesis that happens even when we're out just walking the dog, and we don't have to be running. So the neurons, they specialize, and that's one of the things that happens in utero, is they get sent to certain areas of the brain, and then those areas of the brain specialize in certain things, and then they create connections with each other, which are called the synapses. And we have millions of neurons. We have trillions of synaptic connections between those neurons. So neurons can connect to multiple neurons, and they do so. Now, when I say connect and actually have my fingers touching, that's actually not exactly right, because what happens is they get really, really close, and it's what's called the synaptic cleft, and you can see that in this piece that's highlighted here. And the neuron that's giving the information, so this is the axon, the information, is transmitting a neurotransmitter. So information is being transmitted to the dendrite of the other neuron. And if any of you guys have ever taken an antidepressant, especially what's called a selective serotonin uptake inhibitor, which is, I think, still the most common form of antidepressant, what that does is, so one of the theories behind depression is that when that serotonin is released by this one neuron to be received by this other neuron, that it's not remaining, that neurotransmitter serotonin is not remaining in that synaptic cleft long enough for the other one, the dendrite part of the neuron, to suck that up quickly enough. And so what a SSRI does is it lengthens the amount of time that serotonin remains in that synaptic cleft in order for the other neuron to be able to receive sufficient serotonin. So that's one way. And then we have all kinds of neurotransmitters. You guys have heard of dopamine, and we're going to talk about norepinephrine, and I mean, there's just so many. There's a lot. I think the ones we talk about a lot are serotonin and dopamine, and those are very important in our lives. And but there's a lot. And we'll talk briefly about critical and sensitive periods. And this is something that I feel very strongly about. And the research is, this is probably one of those things, once again, that you can look at a big group and make one determination, but then at the individual level, it can be very different. I tend to prefer the idea of sensitive periods, I think mostly because it's more hopeful, but there is research that backs it up too than critical periods. Now, critical periods, this initial theory comes out of, and many of you guys may have read about this study. So a long time ago, I think it was in the 1960s, if I remember right. there was these researchers that were awful human beings, and they sewed the eyelids of kittens shut for the first, I can't remember how long, whatever length of time, maybe days or weeks they were newborn kittens. And then they unsewed their eyelids and found that these kittens were blind. And so the idea then is that because those kittens didn't receive the input through their eyes to their brain to develop the system for vision, that system just shut off and said, oh, we're not getting any information from the outside. We don't need this. And so it didn't. And our brains are very efficient. And so if I don't get the capacity, if I don't get the information that tells me I need this capacity, I'm going to get rid of that capacity, because why am I going to keep a capacity that I don't need? So that's some of the earliest research that supports the idea of critical periods. There is some later research that had other researchers who actually reversed those effects. So all these poor little kittens all over the world have had their eyelids sewn shut to see what happens, and then what happens, can we reverse it? And there is some research that shows that they've been able to. And so I preferred it. So that's what critical is. So the idea is that if I don't get this, then I'm never going to do it. Like I said, there's research indicates that that's not true. Sensitive periods is the idea then that ideally we get what we need when we need it for optimal brain development. But if we don't, our brains are plastic enough that if we get the input later, we can still develop that capacity. Now, this is where it goes back to something I said early on, that I don't know so much we're changing what was originally laid down. We are just creating new pathways, but then you may have competing pathways. And this is true for, any of us who've, so I'll give you this quick example of, and this is one I think most of us have done, is you get a new phone. And I just switched from my old iPhone 6 that still had the home button to a much newer iPhone that doesn't have the home button anymore. And I was like, how do I do this? Because I only know the home button. I've had the home button for, since the beginning of the iPhone. And I have learned how to do that. But I will tell you, there are lots of times when I still try to do this first thing. So I have two pathways in my brain. I have a pathway that teaches me how to, knows how to use this iPhone without a home button. But I have the other pathway that when I'm not fully engaged, maybe when I'm really tired or I'm in a hurry or I'm stressed, that goes back to that home button. And so I haven't gotten rid of that pathway, it's still there. But I have this competing path. And the more I use this pathway, the stronger this one will become, and the less likely then I will be to start reverting to this one. But most of us have this experience in our lives. We have these competing pathways. And the trick is that we have to practice and really work to keep those new pathways, get them strong. And the idea then is what's called the Heb Rule. Well, Heb Rule, those fire together, wire together. So the more our neuron systems fire in conjunction with each other, we create systems and they wire, all of that wires together. But also part of this says that the more often I use these connections, the stronger and stronger they become, and the more the quicker I go to that one instead of the other one. So when we start to teach kids new skills and new ways of being, it's critical that we are very conscious, and they are too, that we are actually laying down new pathways, and it will take you effort to remember to use that and practice so those get stronger, and then they start to become the default pattern. And just a quick example of this is that when we're born as human beings, we have the capacity to learn any language in the world. And the language that we learn, of course, is the one, or maybe if we're lucky, two, possibly three. Kids can learn successfully up to 3 languages from the very beginning. More than 3 starts to get a little bit confusing for the brain, but they can 2 easy, 3 okay, and then 4 gets complicated. But we can, whatever language we're being exposed to is the language that we learn. So if we are not being exposed to a tonal language like Mandarin Chinese, our brain will prune the capacity to differentiate between tones in a tonal language. And it becomes harder then to learn that tonal language, but can we? And the answer is yes. I have one of my best friends that her daughter is in a Chinese immersion program, and she's in 4th grade. She's 10 years old. She didn't start doing this program till she was 5 years old. So really after that tonal language capacity had been pruned for her. Oh, I forgot to tell you this part. It's by 11 months of age. So by 11 months of age, if we're not being exposed to a tonal language, we prune that capacity. But her daughter started this program at age 5. She's now 10, and she's tested at a middle school level of her Chinese fluency. And that includes differentiating the tones as well as being able to produce the tones. So she was able to get that back, but not without effort. And so it would have been a lot less effort if she'd been exposed to Mandarin Chinese from when she was born. But that didn't start happening until she was age 5, but she still was able to maintain it. Now, obviously 5 is still going to be better than 20, trying to learn that language at 20, but it's still going to be done. But usually, and I think if I remember, it's after 12 years of age, I can't remember exactly, that we can learn that other language, but we'll probably always have an accent, and we'll probably always make grammatical errors. And I love that analogy, though, because for a lot of us, once again, that's true. We have these initial pathways that have gotten laid down in systems that have developed, and we can develop new ones, but that doesn't mean those new ones are always going to be perfect and look just like it would have if I'd done it then. And so then we accept, okay, I got this, but I have an accent and I'm going to make grammatical errors, but I still can speak the language pretty well. And, and for whatever, and that's just an analogy for a lot of things in our lives, that we can learn a lot of things, and that includes relationships, that includes feeling safe in the world, that includes managing things like anxiety and depression, that once again, there's strength and struggle in both of those things. And then I've mentioned this phrase a few times now. One book I highly recommend, and in fact, if the only book you want to read at the end of this presentation is What Happened to You by Dr. Bruce Perry, that would do you and do you very well. And I highly recommend it. And some of you may have already read it. It was actually written in conjunction with Oprah Winfrey. And I had a guy recently that got really annoyed. He said, if you quote Oprah Winfrey, then you have no credibility. And I'm like, well, we're not quoting Oprah Winfrey. We're actually quoting Bruce Perry talking to Oprah Winfrey. There's a difference there. So this is actually, it was written as a conversation between Dr. Perry and Oprah Winfrey. And if you can, I really recommend getting the audiobook because they actually read their parts. So Dr. Perry reads his part and Oprah Winfrey reads her part. And so you really feel like you're eavesdropping on this conversation. And it's the worst, but the bad thing about audiobooks is then you can't like underline things and all that kind of stuff. So maybe you have both of them. But the book is called What Happened to You? And if you just Google it in Amazon, you'll find it, or wherever you buy your books. And it's excellent. So Dr. Perry is one of the foremost experts in brain development for children who've experienced trauma. And he is brilliant. And you'll see this quote is from 1999. That's actually when I started working with Utah foster care. And I luckily came across his information very early on. And he's really informed a lot of our work. So even before child welfare in Utah really started using trauma responsive ways of training, that's what Utah foster care was training, because we were lucky enough to have been exposed to Dr. Perry's work really early on. I see there's a couple of chats in there. Anything I need to respond to?
It's supporting the book. Somebody said it was a great book, and then I put in, this is actually the second time I've had a referral for not only the book, but the audio within the last week. So I just shared that with
it's a sign. Do it. Okay, yeah, it is. It's excellent. It really is very, very good. And when you listen to it, it goes so fast, but then you can listen to it again. So it's so good. Anyway, so Dr. Perry is brilliant and amazing, and he's an empiricist too. So this isn't just him coming up with things that sound interesting. There's actually empirical, and he's very careful too. I was listening to a podcast with him where he was being interviewed about the book, and it's fascinating to listen to him because he's very careful. He doesn't make extraordinary claims. He's very tempered in what he talks about, and I think you can have very good confidence in the things he's presenting, and so I just love him. But one thing we learned really early on from him is that the prime directive of the brain is survival, and I think this is really important because and this goes back to maybe, I don't know, maybe about 10 years ago when we started seeing combat veterans from Afghanistan and Iraq returning from combat. And there was a lot of, in the news, a lot about PTSD, which I'll talk about in a little bit too. And I remember hearing this therapist who works with some of these combat veterans coming home. And she said the first thing she said is she doesn't use the term PTSD. I mean, she might use that shorthand way of talking about it. But when she talks about it, and you hear I've heard a lot of people talk about it this way too since then, is she just says post-traumatic stress. She doesn't say post-traumatic stress disorder. And the reason why, she said, they're not disordered. Their brain is actually doing exactly what it's supposed to do in response to trauma. And so she said, so when we talk about this as a disorder, we are saying somehow your brain didn't respond appropriately, when actually their brain responded entirely appropriately. And our kids, the same thing. So kids who may be aggressive and maybe oppositional, maybe they shut down, maybe they avoid things, maybe they display learned helplessness. And we think, what's wrong with this kid? And that's kind of where the title of the book by Dr. Perry, What Happened to You, the trauma responsive shift is we go from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. Also understanding that we are more than what's happened to us. And so we always want to keep that in mind too. But when we think about what happened to you and we contextualize the behavior of this kid, that behavior no longer looks pathological or disordered or bad. It looks normal and it looks smart. And so one thing I try to help our families that I work with see is if you have a kid who's exhibiting these survival behaviors, aggression, opposition, stubbornness, shutting down, running away, avoidance, honor and respect those behaviors. Say to that kid, you had to learn to be a fighter because the environment you grew up in required that of you to survive. And I honor that part of your brain that fights back. Now what we need to do is help you to see that you're no longer in that environment that requires you to fight and that you're safe. And we can start to develop those other pathways. Understanding the fighting pathway is probably always going to be there. Because the brain's not going to give that up, because the brain's going to be like, you never know. But we can start to develop alternative pathways that get strengthened and practiced and grooved in. But I want to respect those behaviors for my kid. Instead of thinking it is something I need to get rid of, I want to honor and respect it and for the role it played in this child's survival. And also help the child understand that they don't need that behavior anymore. And the brain will keep it on backup, but they can develop new behaviors. This is also from Dr. Perry, understanding that whatever the developmental experience was, we see that reflected in the brain development and thus the behaviors on the part of the child. Now you look at this on my screen, it's the left hand. All of these are experienced by, well, maybe not always physical abuse, but certainly those first three, and often that last one. All of these are very common experiences for children who come into care. And I know you guys also have kids in DJS custody, and I would say that that's true for them too. That in fact, years ago, we used to do some training for DJS as they were moving to being more trauma responsive. Because, we were beginning to understand these aren't bad kids. these are traumatized, terrified kids. And if we approach them with that mindset, we're much more likely to be able to help them overcome the behaviors that are hurting them and potentially hurting other people, because these behaviors can become problematic if they persist in an environment that doesn't require it. So then if we see a child who's experienced all of these things on the left hand, then you can see why some of these kids have so many overlapping and layering and just all of these difficulties, and trying to figure out, where do we start? How do we help these kids? And we'll talk a little bit about that. And there's actually, what's nice is that anything that responds to any one of these is probably going to help all of these, because they are all responses to the brain not feeling safe. That when that brain can begin to feel safe, that can help begin to rework alternative pathways. Okay, really watch the time here, because I seriously could talk for like 8 hours and you guys would not like that. So I want to talk a little about the Triune Brain. This is one of my favorite things I've ever learned. So I remember learning this really early on. This is Paul MacLean, who was a neurologist in the 1950s. He came up with what's called the Triune Brain Theory, and this is still widely used. And any of you guys know Daniel Siegel's work. So Bruce Perry and Daniel Siegel and Brene Brown. These are like the three shining lights at Utah Foster Care. These people have informed our work and our approach dramatically. So Daniel Siegel, also really famous for his work, not as much as a researcher. Dr. Perry is much more like, in the lab, on the ground researcher. Dr. Perry does that too. I mean, Dr. Siegel does that too, but I think his real strength is the translation. So he's able to take this sometimes really complicated brain science and make it really, really applicable to our lives. And so he has written this, and the man is prolific. I think Dr. Perry's written 3 or 4 books. Dr. Siegel's probably written like 20-something books. I mean, this guy writes books like it's nothing. He's amazing. And also audiobooks. He reads his own audiobooks, which I also love, because I love his voice. But I will tell you, don't listen to them if you're feeling sleepy and you're driving, because his voice is very calming and you'll drive off the road. But he's great, like while you're making dinner, walking the dog, gardening, to listen to him. He's wonderful. Anyway, so he uses this, and many of you guys may have seen Dr. Siegel do the hand model of the brain, where he has people take their thumb, put it in their palm, bring these 2 fingers, wrap it around the thumb, and then these final 2 fingers, and you just made the hand model of the brain. This part of the brain is the brainstem, which connects into our spinal cord. It is the first part of the brain to fully develop. Many of you guys have also heard it referred to as a reptilian brain. And the reason it's referred to as a reptilian brain is because it is really responsible for our basic survival functions. So heart rate, blood pressure, sleep and wake cycles, appetite, making sure we're eating enough, not eating too much. I think I said body temperature, just regulates all of these things. And these are all survival functions. And this part of the brain, that's all it cares about. And it'll do the same thing over and over again, doesn't care about consequences, doesn't seem to learn from its mistakes, because it doesn't really have a memory. It's just about, how do I survive in this moment? And whatever memory it does have, that memory is tied to survival and these basic functions. So when I do this with the parents, I ask them, does this lizard, I have no idea what kind of lizard this is. Does this lizard sit around thinking about relationships and tone of voice and what it's going to do a week from today? It doesn't, because it doesn't have the brain capacity to do those things. Its brain, just like our lower brain, is all about survival. Now, for us as humans, this is the only part of the brain that's fully functional at birth, and that makes sense because it's about survival. And it is also the part of the brain that is large and in charge for little kids. And so sometimes, after I teach a class, I'll have someone come up to me and they'll ask me, they'll tell me about their 3-year-old child. And they'll say, my 3-year-old son hits everybody. He likes to hit people. And they say, what should I do? And I usually say, wait until they're 4. Because up until about age 4, your child is an iguana. I mean, they're just, that's just the part of the brain that's developed and in charge of everything. And that's just the nature of the beast at that point. So obviously we teach them and we contain them and we redirect them. We do all those, those gentle parenting techniques. We tell them we don't hurt people, because all the things are laying down information for later on. But the reality is that a lot of it is just management because they're iguanas. Now, with our kids who come into care, maybe at 10 or 12 or even 15, we think, well, they're not 3. They surely aren't going to be acting like this. But if I've been living in an environment, and so I'm going to flip back to this slide right here. If I've been living in an environment where I don't know if mom's coming home tonight, if she is coming home, I don't know if she's coming home alone, if she's coming home with one of her boyfriends, and is she coming home with one of the nice boyfriends, or is she coming home with one of the scary boyfriends? Is she bringing food? Because we don't have any food in the house, and we haven't had any food in the house for 2 days. If that's my world, this is my brain. Because I live in a world that requires a strong part of this brain. Now, we had a foster mom, adoptive mom in Salt Lake that this is, oh my gosh, this has probably been, I bet almost 40 years ago, maybe not quite 40 years ago, maybe about 30, 35 years ago. But she and her husband adopted 4 boys from Guatemala, brothers. And they were 10, 7, 5, and 4. And they'd been street children for 4 years. So the mother, after she gave birth to the 4th child, she disappeared. They had no idea what happened to her. She just was gone. And so these boys just started having to fend for themselves. The oldest one at the time was 6, and he became like the daddy of the family, took care of everybody, and kept them alive and together for 4 years on the streets of Guatemala. So then they get adopted here to Salt Lake City, Utah. And Marilyn said that the oldest boy, and this really makes sense, he was the father. He was very responsible. And she said, just the most amazing kid you'd ever want to meet. And when he was 17, he went out with friends one night. This is before cell phones. He went out with friends one night and didn't come home on time. So at curfew at midnight, he didn't come home. And Marilyn was really, really worried because she said this kid never missed curfew. And if by chance he had to, he always called. She said, so when he didn't come home and he didn't call, she was convinced something had happened to it. And so she said she just, fretted and fretted and fretted. She called the police, which, they're not going to do anything about it. And worried and worried and worried. And finally, about 3 o'clock in the morning, he walks in the door. And she does the mama thing where she starts yelling at him, but also hugging him. And she said that he pulled back from the hug and he took her hand and put, her hand in his, and then he put his other hand on top of her hand and patted her hand. And he said, Mama, he said, if you had any idea what I've seen in my life, you wouldn't be worried about me on the streets of Salt Lake City at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'm good. This kid had a very well-developed reptilian brain. Now, you're not catching me on the streets of Salt Lake City at 3 o'clock in the morning, even 20 years ago, because I haven't had a life that has required me to develop this part of my brain stronger than just typical. So these kids, once again, have strengths that need to be contextualized and sometimes modified, that we, once again, want to honor and respect, just like we would with that kid. Okay, so we get to our thumbnail, which is called the mammalian brain. And this part of the brain is one we share in common with mammals. Now, does this creature care about your feelings or your relationship, or if you had a bad day at work? They don't care. Does she care? She cares. Yeah. So, and part of the reason why is because we share this part of our brain in common. And this is now, we're getting into relationship and connection and attachment and attunement and emotion, and kind of that gut feeling of what's right and wrong lives here too. And this is why we are then now able to establish more of an emotional relationship with other mammals, other human beings, dogs, apparently cats, horses, other mammals, because it's part of in common. Now, a lot of our kids in care get diagnosed, well, not as much anymore, but it used to be kind of par for the course that kids in care got diagnosed with attachment disorder or reactive attachment disorder, and that's a whole nother presentation, and oftentimes very inaccurate representation of what's going on with these kids. But one thing I always tell people is that if you have a child who's struggling to connect to you, struggling to be attached, feel attached to you, they're not disordered, they're iguanas. And they're iguanas because they've had to be. And once they begin to feel safe in this new environment, which new is always threatening, so it's going to take a while, and this new relationship, which they may have never had before, a relationship that we expect reciprocity, we expect something back, we are engaged in this two-part dance. They don't know the steps. And so before we can get them to the Labrador brain, they have to feel safe or they're never going to get here. So a kid who's struggling with attachment, couple things. One is they probably have had a lot of history of secure attachment. And second, they may not feel safe. And so their ability to be safe, to feel safe, is when that connection, that attachment, that attunement, that emotional dance begins to emerge. And then two parts I want to talk about with the neocortex. First, what's called the prefrontal neocortex. So this is straight back, you notice this part of the thumb is way buried deep in the middle of our brain. This is also where the amygdala lives, which also helps to regulate fear. So we have a lot of redundancies in our brain, and one of them is fear regulation, recognition and regulation, which makes sense because our brain is about survival. And that's in this mammalian part too. And the prefrontal neocortex, so Daniel Siegel is particularly fascinated with this part of the brain because it's the only part of the brain that touches all three parts of the brain. So it has deep connections into the neocortex, into the amygdala. It also reaches down to the midbrain. And I'll talk about the importance of this in just a minute. And then finally, the neocortex. So before we were starting, Amanda said that some of you might be young. You might be in your early 20s. And what we know from brain research is that our neocortex, so the very top layer of our brain, isn't really fully developed until females are probably 23 to 25, and males are usually around 25 to 28. So if you, as I was talking to, I volunteered our children's Sunday school in my congregation, and I have 10-year-old boys who are the most delightful human beings on the face of the planet. I love these kids. And I was talking to them about this the other day. I said, your guys' brains aren't going to be fully developed for another like 15 years. I said, you got a lot of time to learn and make mistakes. And they were fascinated by that. So if any of you have 17-year-old kids that you're like, oh my gosh, what is up with this kid? If it's a boy, they've got 10 years of brain development to go. And a girl, probably about 8 years of brain development to go, provided that everything else is typical. And it could be longer for some people. So I find that really hopeful. And it's interesting too that, our culture or our country says that people are adults when they're 18 to 21, but neurology says we're really not adults till we're probably 25 to 30, which I think is interesting that car insurance companies actually know better this than anybody, because car accidents decrease dramatically after age 25. And this makes perfect sense because our brains develop in such a way that we're less impetuous, we're less likely to make those kind of mistakes that lead to car accidents. So our car insurance companies understand better than our culture does when we become adults. Now I want to talk really quick, and I'm really careful about these slides. I always have to provide this disclaimer because I'm going to have a slide that talks about boys, and I'm going to have a slide that talks about girls. First of all, this either or is probably not really accurate. We can have females who look like the males, this slide says male, and we have males who look like this slide. And so I want to be really careful that I'm not essentializing here, and that we allow individuals to be individuals, and that we're not trying to just say, well, you're a boy or you're a girl, so you should act or look like this. And this certainly can look very different, kid to kid. As a whole, so once again, big picture, big numbers, definitely not to the individual, but big pictures, we do see certain ways of presenting as more common in males and females. And so, but I still want to be really careful and leave lots of room for individuality, because we're much more complicated than just, that binary. So what often is seen in boys and can be seen in girls is a heightened norepinephrine, which is part of adrenaline, response to trauma. So this is the fight and flight. And Dr. Perry has some really fascinating work on this. I think he talks about this in the book, that he worked with some of the kids that came out of the Waco compound. And some of you, if you're young enough, you may not be real familiar with that. But there was a cult leader in Waco, Texas in the 1990s, if I remember correctly, who had all these people, adults, children, families, in this compound down in Waco, Texas. And there was a multi-day, if not multi-week, standoff with different federal agencies. I think the FBI was there, alcohol, ATF was there, and it's still, anyway, I'm not gonna get into that, but anyway, it was a really traumatic event. But during the standoff, they did release a certain number of kids. I can't remember how many, 20 something kids. And those kids went to a group home. I think it was still in Waco, but well outside of the compound. And later on, several days later, there was a fire that killed most of the people in the compound. It was an incredibly tragic event. But these kids who were able to get out, they'd been traumatized before they had left. They'd been traumatized by being in the cult because there was a lot of problems there. Traumatized by the standoff, traumatized by being released and separated from their family, and then traumatized because of the fire that happened that killed many of their families. And Dr. Perry worked with these kids. And one of the things that he was fascinated by is that the heart rate of some of these kids was at a very high rate, even though they were coloring or eating lunch. They seemed fine on the outside. He said they looked, and the way he found this out is, I guess he'd been for a run, and he came back from the run and went to the group home, and he had on one of those watches that checks your heart rate. And one of the boys wanted to wear the watch. And so Dr. Perry said, sure. And he let him put the watch on. And Dr. Perry's like, oh my gosh, this kid's, and I'll show you a slide, the next slide. This kid's heart rate is off the charts, but he looked calm. He didn't look upset. He hadn't been running around. He was just sitting at a table doing some kind of craft. And so this led Dr. Perry to start investigating this piece of it. But because of that heightened adrenaline, that, oh, I gotta be ready, I gotta be ready, I gotta be ready. Even if I look calm, my body is always on, ready to go. Obviously, sleep difficulties. These kids have a hard time settling down at night. And this makes so much sense too, because I still remember hearing an evolutionary biologist say, sleep must be really important because it's incredibly dangerous for us to sleep. And he said, there's no time where we're more likely to be eaten than when we're asleep, which I thought was something so funny, a funny line. But sleep is really dangerous. And particularly for kids who scary things that happen at night, sleep is an incredibly vulnerable thing to do. And so for these kids getting to sleep, obviously a hard time concentrating, and that's because they're paying attention to everything. And because they have to. They're startled, anxiety, all these things. Now you look at this slide, if I were to ask you, and I used to do this in person, if I were to ask you, what do these kids get diagnosed as? You guys know it immediately. These kids get diagnosed with ADHD. Now they might be, because there's something called comorbidity, so they could be. But more and more pediatricians and other therapists are trying to untangle this and look when a kid is brought into them and they're presenting with ADHD symptoms. A history is really important because this kid comes out of a traumatic environment. we may be looking at post-traumatic stress rather than ADHD. We could be looking at both of them. But what's really happening here for this kid? And also, I'll talk about it in a second, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is a chart that shows where those heart rates are. So you look at the control line, which is that lower line. That's typical heart rate in these kids, in kids without a trauma history. But then you look at these different categories of kids, and that kid, that almost 150 beats per minute, that's what Dr. Perry was seeing. But even the others that are not as high are still much, much higher than typical. And so seeing those increased heart rates, which once again makes sense, that the brain is getting the body ready to fight or flight if it needs to. Now, the flip side of this, and once again, I also want to be careful, because you can also have a kid who presents both ways, just different situations trigger different responses. Because once again, it's whatever would have helped them survive. That's what's gonna work. Now, typically females or very young children present like this, and that's because they cannot fight and they cannot run away. So this is the freeze response. Also, I want to add another one in here. And I had a professor at the University of Utah who she called it tend and befriend. Other research I've seen recently has been calling it the fawn response, so FAWN, like a very young deer response. But also the word fawn, like fawning, which I'll talk about in just a second. So these kids, this is associated then with the opiate system. And opiate is calming. It brings everything down. So while adrenaline revs everything up, this brings everything down. And this is the freeze, this is the possum, this is the playing dead, because I can't get away from whatever is threatening me or hurting me. And so I have to find a way to deal with it. And so the body brings everything down. Now we have this response too. You're cutting onions for dinner, and you, if you're like me with poor spatial relations, slice your finger, and you're like, oh my gosh. And so you turn the water on, it's bleeding, you run it under the water. Usually when you're looking at it, most of us look at that and we think, oh, geez, and how deep is it? Do I need stitches? Where are the Band-Aids? And our thinking is actually fairly clear. And in that moment, things usually slow down and we get it attended to, whether it's a Band-Aid, we might have to go in for stitches if it's deep enough, but it doesn't start hurting for quite a while after the cut. And the reason why is because our body in that moment releases our own natural heroin, opiates, which is a painkiller, also slows things down and calms us down. And then only once that's worn off do we begin to experience the pain of that. So I'll give you a story, and I think Dr. Perry does talk about this in his book. He has another book called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, which I think is his first book. I think he talks about this in his newest one too. But he had a young woman that he was called in to consult on. She had been brought into the emergency room. She had passed out at school, I think in the bathroom, and they brought her in, and she was passed out. She was unconscious, and they tried all the things to revive her, and they couldn't revive her. And her mother was there, and her mother was really, really reacting very strongly. And so they brought Dr. Perry in to actually work with the mother to help calm her down. But Dr. Perry said he took a look at this girl, and he said she had cut marks, all up and down her arms. And I'm mixing it up, so I shouldn't tell the story when I can't remember all the details, but if you read the book, I'm pretty sure it's in this one. I know it's in The Boy Who's Raised as a Dog. But he saw that she was a cutter. Now, what happens when they cut? And this is something we see a lot with our kids. So the cutting happens, and you hear kids say things like, it doesn't hurt, it helps me, it calms me down, it helps me focus. And all of that makes perfect sense, because what they're doing is they're releasing their body's own opiates for heroin. And so it's kind of low-grade heroin, and it's addictive because opiates are addicting. So anyway, Dr. Perry saw all these cut marks on her, and there's some other clues about how she was dressed and that. And he said, he told the emergency room doctors to try and, oh my gosh. Okay, you guys have to help me. It's I always forget this, Narcan. It's to counteract opiate overdose. So Narcan, he said, try that. And they were like, there's no drugs. And I don't know how they knew that, but they said, that's not what it is. Anyway, they did. And it revived her. And so Dr. Perry then goes on in talking about this to talk about what happened in that moment for her is something had happened. And he talks about what it is in the book. Something had happened that had brought like all of this trauma. There's a lot of sexual abuse and domestic violence and just a really traumatic history for this girl and her mother. And that she had fainted. She just, when we talk about freezing, I mean, she had the most extreme form of that and had lost consciousness. But Dr. Perry said what it was an over release of that opiates and her own opiates in her system. And so the Narcan then counteracted that. It's a fascinating story, and highly recommend that you guys read it, whether it's in The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, and I'm pretty sure it's in his newest book.
Lynn?
Yeah.
There was a question, is that presented as kind of catatonic?
Ooh, see, and that's where I'm not going to, I would say something that I don't know the answer to. I would just be guessing. But go ahead and Google that. Google like catatonic, opiates, trauma, and there's my guess is there's something out there about that. Because I know the term catatonic, but I'm not sure if that is the same thing as this. So someone Google that, and if you figure it out while we're talking, then you can tell me, because that's something I don't know. And that's one reason too I love your questions and your insight, is because I always learn something from you guys whenever I teach. So this may be something I learned. No, we'll see. Okay, so then you look at this list here, and so the first time I remember I have two things happened when I came across this information when I first started working at Utah Foster Care. Is one, I thought, oh my gosh. I used to work, when I worked at Salt Lake County, I worked at the girls' group home. And we saw some of the girls like this for sure. But we saw this a ton. And I still remember, and I still feel, all these years later, I still feel so dumb that these girls, 15, 16, 17-year-old girls, and they were consistently putting themselves at risk. They'd run away, they'd have some adult male pick them up, they'd run away and on the streets, and they'd hitchhike and get in cars with people they didn't know. I mean, these girls were living such dangerous lives. And I would say to them, because I was so dumb, I was like 22, 23, and I would say to them, no, don't do that. You need to finish high school and go to college, because that's what I had done, because that was the life that I was lucky enough to have. And these girls would look at me like I was crazy, because of course I was. And some of them even said to me, I won't live that long. And at least 3 of them didn't. 1 suicide, 1 murder, and 1 car accident. At least 3 of them didn't. And this makes sense though, because they understood at a visceral level how fragile life was. And they had no illusions that they were going to make it through, because it was so dangerous. Whereas I had never confronted what they had confronted. And so I believed that there was a future, there was hope, things got better. They had no reason to believe that. The overcompliance, and we saw some of these girls too, not as much, but this is that tendon befriend or that fawning. This is that kid who makes friends with the adults right away, or tries to figure out which kid is in charge and tries to align themselves with that kid. They're really compliant. They're super people pleasers. They never say no. They do everything they can, and this makes perfect sense. This is keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So this also is a very vital survival strategy, especially for someone who can't fight back, who can't run away. Well, then I better make the best of the situation. So the other thing that happened when I came across this information and started really delving into it was, I have one of my best friends. We've been best friends since like 7th grade. And I was reading some of this stuff and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is her. And so I called her and I said, we need to go out to dinner. I said, I want to show you something. So we went out to dinner, and I don't know if I had the slide or if I don't remember what I had, but I had something and I showed it to her. I said, this is you. And she's like, oh my gosh, it is. And she was, and I think this is important to know, because she was raised in a family that was never involved in the system. She had a mom, she had a dad. They, while not anywhere near affluent, they weren't financially destitute. They were, working class, lower middle class. She was the oldest girl, the third child, but the oldest girl, and then third child of 6. So there were 3 children younger than her. But her mother was very emotionally abusive. She would get angry at my friend and do the silent treatment thing for days. And when my friend would ask her, what did I do wrong? What are you upset about? Her mother would say to her, if you don't know, it means you don't care. And I'm not going to tell you. So she never knew what would upset her mother. Her father had very severe bouts of depression, including multiple suicide attempts. And I still remember she told me one time that she could lay in bed and slow her breathing down so much that she couldn't even hear her own breath. So she could hear everything going on in the house. Now, she's the oldest girl, and this is really important, because in a family, if the oldest child is a girl, that child almost always takes it on. If the oldest child is a boy and there's a girl relatively soon after, they'll still usually take it on. But if the oldest child's a boy and there's no females close after, then that boy usually takes it on. But this is the parentified figure. This is the child who not only looks after her siblings, which she did, and she still does to this day, but also looks after her parents. But this is not someone who was a family that was system involved. This is not piranha trauma. This is water trauma. So piranha trauma are like the big T. This is the big things we can look at a piece of paper and say, oh my gosh, this thing happened when this kid was 7 years old and this makes so much sense. Water trauma is the water I live in is traumatic, but it's low level, it's persistent, it's consistent, it's pervasive, but it never becomes that acute level that reaches system involvement. And to this day, I won't tell you exactly how old we are, but we're well into our adulthood. This is still a struggle, and she and I, we talk about this kind of thing all the time because she still struggles with a lot of these issues, and they're visceral for her. They're at a visceral level for her. So we don't need to have big T trauma for this stuff to happen. This stuff can happen with little t or trauma, water trauma too. And this is just another slide that reiterates the different areas of the brain and the what they tend to be associated with. So we talked about this a little bit already. And I use when I talk about post-traumatic stress, I talk about I do the same things as therapists. I say post-traumatic stress. I don't ever say disorder, but if I just abbreviate it, then I do say PTSD. That once again, so many of our kids who are system involved get diagnosed with these things. These are just par for the course. A kid can barely, walk into a system, foster care system, juvenile justice system, without getting diagnosed with one of these things, because that's just how we've done it for so long. And I'm not saying it isn't ever these things. It can be. Certainly there can be comorbidity, but we always want to look at context and what happened first. This is some research from about just over 20 years ago that they looked at a group of kids who had sexual abuse, physical abuse, or both, and what the most common diagnoses were. And the ones in red are the really high overlap. So you saw really high numbers of kids diagnosed with this consistently across the board, which indicates that it's highly likely that those are traumatic responses, or some kind of mental health issue exacerbated by the trauma. And so it's really coming out in some of these behaviors. Conduct disorders, I mean, a lot of stuff that we see with kids in DJJS, optional defining disorder, conduct disorders, ADHD, all that stuff is really common for kids in system involved. I see a couple chat questions. Are there anything I need to respond to?
Luckily, we have some amazing folks in the group. So we've got a page reference from a boy who was raised by a dog, where Dr. Perry talks about it. He did not categorize it as catatonic, just super disassociative to the point of near death to preserve herself. And then the other comment was about similar, just that they were able to reduce the heart rate to the point that she was able to disassociate with her abuser.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you guys so much for doing that. And the chapter in The Boy Who Raised a Dog, the chapter is called The Raven, where he goes very detailed into this girl's case. And it's fascinating. I'll tell you when I read that, because the cutting is so common, but when I read that, it made so much sense why kids cut. It's not a crazy behavior. It really does make sense why they do that. And then once again, just another chart just showing the prevalence of these psychiatric or mental health diagnoses with trauma. And once again, we can have comorbidity, but we always want to look at the trauma first to untangle some of that. And then susceptibility to trauma. And I think we talked about a few of these things too, that the younger the child is. And so one of the number one variables, well, there's a few, but one of the number one variables that reduces traumatic response, so responses that lead to adaptations that might cause difficulty in other situations, is lack of control. And so the younger the child, generally, the greater the trauma effects are, because they didn't have any kind of control over the situation in order to protect themselves. And so their brain will respond much more strongly to protect them in the future. And just really quick, I want to talk about control really quick, because I think it's so important. Control, power, autonomy, these are words we tend to use somewhat interchangeably. I heard a great line yesterday: kids don't want our power, they want their power. I thought that was such a great line. It's really about autonomy. It's not about power. So this is a fascinating study that came out probably about 10 years ago, I'm guessing 8 to 10 years ago. And they were looking at, actually maybe not that long ago, it's maybe been about 5 years. They were looking at some Syrian refugees who were in refugee camps, I think in Lebanon, if I remember correctly. And there are different camps run by different organizations. And in one of these organizations, everything was provided for the camp dwellers. So all their meals were provided, everything was provided. They would come and pick up the pre-made food and take it back and eat it, or heat it up. I'm not quite sure exactly what that looked like, but all of that was provided. The other camp, their model was they would set up like grocery stores. So, little places where people could come and they could select the items that they wanted to make the food that they wanted to make. And then they looked at, and I'm pretty sure they didn't set this up, as a control and an experimental. I think it was just how it was. But these researchers were interested in that, and they looked at the level of traumatic response in those two groups. And not surprisingly, the group that was able to have more control over their food, actually demonstrated less traumatic responses. They were more resilient. And so something as simple as that, being able to decide what you want to eat for dinner and make it yourself. Now, the other one seems nice, like I'm providing everything for them. They don't have to worry about it. We'll take care of it. But autonomy, being able to make choices for ourselves, is so critical to both help to prevent traumatic responses, but also to be more resilient, even in the face of traumatic response. So giving kids as much autonomy as possible and is safe turns out to be and there's other research too with kids and adolescents, really important. So remember, kids don't want our power, they want their power, they want autonomy, and we want to give that to them. Oh, yes.
I was going to say there's a chat. So one question, would a dismissive avoidant attachment style be definitely associated with a mother that is on drugs or alcohol, prostitution and homelessness, and many of the foster homes?
Maybe, but maybe not. There's so many different, so on paper, there are 4 attachment categories of relationship. So, and I want to be really careful here. When we talk about attachments, we're talking about we're categorizing the relationship. We're not categorizing the individual, because attachment exists between us. It doesn't exist in us. Now, the history of those attachments do live in us, but they manifest between us. They're created and then manifest between us. So dismissive, one thing I'll tell you how readily this can happen. First, dismissive or avoidant is the second most common pattern of attachment relationship in the United States of America. So the first is secure at about 45 to 55%. Sorry, 55 to 65%. But avoidant or dismissive, avoidance, what we call it in childhood, the relationship in childhood, dismissive is what we call it in adulthood, is about 25%. But this is extremely normative. And I'll give you a quick example of this. So I was at a neighbor's house one night, lovely people, good parents, really like them. Their son, he was about 4, and he was outside. It was in the summer, so it was about 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, so it was still light. But he came in the house and he was like the devastated cry. And his dad said, "What's wrong?" Because he thought maybe he got hurt. And the boy said, "Max, I had to go to bed." You know, Max's little friend across the street. And so his dad said to him, "Okay, you know what you need to do if you're going to cry." And in their family, the rule was if you cry, you go in your room and you cry by yourself because no one wants to see you cry. That classic avoidance. Because what we have going on here is a parent who cannot tolerate their child's affect. And so they shut that affect down because it's overwhelming for the parent. And oftentimes those parents have that same kind of history, and that's why they can't tolerate it, because their caregiver couldn't tolerate it in them. So dismissing and avoidant is extremely normative. And it's not a disorder. It's not pathological. It's probably just a variant of attachment. I'm very hesitant to, even though I think secure attachment, I don't just think it, research does show that it's very protective. People can have productive lives who have less than secure attachment histories, and we can change them too. What we're probably going to see in that parent who is living the kind of life you're talking about is probably more of a disorganized attachment pattern, which means I have a caregiver who is both the source of threat and the source of comfort. So sometimes they show up when they're sober, and then they don't show up when they're high. Or they disappear for days, and then they show back up, they're unavailable, and then they're available. And so and then there's, a lot of other mixed signals going on, and maybe there's some violence, maybe the parent is dissociating. So there's trauma involved in that attachment relationship. We're more likely to see disorganized there. That is the most common attachment category we see for children in foster care. About 80% of children who come into foster care have a disorganized attachment history with their primary caregiver. And those kids, really essential that we recognize what they're eliciting in us as alternative caregivers, because they don't know, once again, they don't know the dance. The dance is confusing to them, which means that they're going to do things. We're going to try to engage in attachment dance with them, and we're doing the jitterbug and they're doing the waltz, and we're confused. But I'll tell you, they're just as confused. So does that answer the question? I don't know the person who asked that, if there's something you want to follow up with that one. Attachment's a whole nother.
It is, and that answers the question. And while I'm off mute, I just want to give you about a 7-minute warning.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So the one I really want to focus on this one is that quick intervention, which is kind of the piece that's out. If a child has a trauma history, has these trauma responses, something triggers them. And it can be anything. Dr. Perry talks about a guy who had the same aftershave as an abuser of a child. It can be a time of day, it can be a time of year, it can be a temperature, it can be a name, it can be so many things can trigger. Because when we experience a traumatic event, our brain records as many things about that situation as possible so it can be prepared the next time that thing happens. So, and many of these operate subcortical, nonverbal, non-explicit memory. And so the child doesn't even know other triggers. But we know they're triggered when their response to the situation makes no sense at all. They over-respond, they dissociate. We know that there's something has happened that has triggered them. So the most important thing is to intervene quickly, because the longer and the more often they go into those pathways of responsive trauma, the deeper and deeper those grooves get. And so we want to intervene. Oh, honey, you're safe. You're here. You're right now. Everything's okay. Take a drink of water. A really cold, you can feel it going down. A cold drink can bring us back to space and time. A deep breath, orientation. Let's look around for a second. What do you see? Tell me one thing. Tell me a blue thing, tell me a brown thing, tell me a green thing. What we're trying to do is reorient them to time and place. It's not happening, it happened. You're safe now. And that means we're attuned. So we're not over-responding, we're not dismissing. This one is hard for me because my tendency, so the way I grew up in a family in which affect, so emotional response, too much was not okay. So we learned to kind of play everything cool. So when I encounter someone with a lot of affect, my response is calm down, knock it off, quit your whining, suck it up, because that's how I was raised. And a lot of affect makes me really uncomfortable. So if I have a kid who's responding to trauma with a lot of affect, my response is, you're not Shakespeare, quit the drama. I don't like it. That's my need, not their need. And so in that moment, I need to think, okay, this is my natural response, not helpful. What do they need? Not what do I need? And try to respond that way. I talked about implicit a little bit. That subcortical pre-verbal memory controls a lot of stuff that goes on in our lives. We're not even aware of it most of the time. This gets into more long-term stuff, but Dr. Siegel talks quite a bit about this, making the implicit explicit. The more we can talk about what happens subcortically, and sometimes it's just guessing, helps us to have more control over it. So if you have a long-term relationship with a child, helping them make sense and story some of the stuff that's happened to them, and a lot of that is more probably at the parental level or the therapeutic level. We don't have time to get an attachment in the brain. I do want to talk about this really briefly. So I want to really, another book, The Whole Brainchild by Dr. Siegel and Drs. Tina Payne Bryson. Drs. Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson. I'm sorry, I'm not saying that right. Anyway, both Daniel Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson wrote this book. They've actually written a series of, I think it's 4 or 5 books that are fantastic. And The Whole Brainchild is wonderful, super accessible. I recommend it to all families, not just parents of kids in care. But this gets into the prefrontal cortex. So the whole book is really about how to develop this in our child. And this is what the prefrontal cortex does. It helps regulate our autonomic systems. It helps us to have attuned communication. So responsive, aware, empathetic communication helps us with our emotional regulation, which is what allows me to have that attuned communication. Because if I get overwhelmed by you, I can't be attuned. So I have to be able to regulate my own emotional experience and sometimes co-regulate that too, which is part of the attuned. Flexibility. I know a lot of you work with kids who are super rigid, that if something was supposed to go one way, if something happens to make it go another way, they get really upset. Being flexible is the key piece of the prefrontal cortex. The ability to read someone else's mind. So not like, are they thinking about blue or whatever, but what do they feel about this? How are they responding? You know, that ability to look at someone and think, you know, gauge our responses based upon their responses, which is definitely a part of attunement. Being self-aware, knowing where I am in time and space. One little girl he worked with said that the prefrontal cortex hugs the amygdala, which once again regulates fear. So when the prefrontal cortex is online and operating, it helps to extinguish fear. When it's offline, or what Dr. Siegel calls flipping our lid, then the fear is in charge. Our intuition, which once again lives here in the limbic, that sense of right and wrong, same thing with morality, sense of right and wrong, conscience lives here. So if I'm offline, this part of the brain isn't here in this part of the brain, and I can't access it by this part of the brain. So anyway, the brain, the whole brain, the book, The Whole Brainchild, is all about developing this in our kids. And while he talks a lot about kind of more typical development, he does talk about trauma as well. And he also, maybe not as much in that book, but in a lot of his other work, he does talk about how trauma affects this and how we can help with that. And then I just want to finish up reiterating once again that safety and relationship, those are the two critical ingredients in calming the brain enough to start to change the brain. Without a sense of safety, which means enough food to eat, a safe place to sleep, safe relational partners, familiarity, competence, physical movement, all of those things tell the brain, you're safe, you're okay, this is a good place. And then that allows the brain to be, we start moving into the more plastic. That's the one thing I didn't talk about. The lower part of the brain is the least plastic. The higher parts of the brain are the most plastic. And our ideal is that we have more power here to change. And then we also want to help this part of the brain strengthen so it can be in charge of this part of the brain. So instead of the iguana being in charge, Shakespeare is in charge here. Okay, I'm done. So any other final, actually, I'm done. I'm really done. Okay. All right. So I think Amanda has my contact. You're more than welcome to ever if you want anything from me, but just get those books. The Boys Raises a Dog, What Happened to You, and The Whole Brainchild. You're good.
Thank you so much, Liz. I appreciate it. Sorry, it's so hard to go through when you know you can expand on the topic. So we will share out the PDF of the PowerPoint and Liz's contact information. So if you have burning questions that we didn't have time to address today, please follow up with Liz. All right, now before I let everybody go, I want to introduce my new supervisor, Benjamin Carrier, who goes by Benji. All right, so Benji is now the Youth and Custody Coordinator for the State Board of Education. Prior to that, he was the alternative high school principal up in Ogden School District. And he served as the principal there for 6.5 years and loved every minute of it. Prior to that, his assignment, Benji was the principal of the Youth and Custody program for Ogden School District, and he oversaw the Mill Creek School, which is a long-term secure facility, as well as the observation and assessment, which is the short-term semi-secure facility. Mr. Carrier has loved serving on the Utah Alternative Education Association for the last 6 years as the president-elect, president, and past president. He's also on the National Alternative Education Board, where he serves as the Region 9 representative. So Benji will be bringing a lot of good professional learning to the table with him. He has 4 energetic and funny children that he loves to go on adventures with. He's an avid CrossFitter who loves doing anything outside, especially biking, hiking, and skiing in the mountains. So I would like to say welcome to Benji, and this is a face that you guys will all be more familiar with moving forward.
All right, well, now I guess I will say something because I replied to everybody.
Oh, goodness, I didn't even see that. Well, now you got that out of the way.
Yeah, she messaged me privately and said, do you want to say anything? And then I wasn't paying attention, replied all, no, I'll just wave. So yeah, that's why you all got a message from me. No, I'll just wave. So yeah, we're pleased to be here. I think the world of Amanda, and am happy to be a part of this group. So, and thank you for all of that learning that we just had on the development of the brain. That was super informative and interesting, and helpful on the way in which we interact with kids. So thank you so much for your time in presenting that.
You are so welcome. We will have more to come on that. It is a hot topic. And here is the website for our post-training survey. You're welcome to take a quick snapshot. And as always, I will include that link in our follow-up email. I love to share back with our presenters. So please take a minute and fill out the post-training survey. And of course, that also qualifies you for points on MIDAS. So thank you so much, everybody, for taking time out of your day to participate. I look forward to seeing you all again next month. Have a wonderful
Amanda.
Yes.
When you send that out, will you send out the names and